The Prime Minister will name his first cabinet since his election win this Tuesday. One of the top priorities for the government, of course, standing up for Canada in the face of tariffs and threats from Donald Trump. And Carney made good on his promise to sit down face-to-face with the U.S. president and take those first steps in resetting the relationship after a rocky few months. Both sides spoke positively about the visit. So what happens next, and how soon can we see change? I spoke with International Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, who was at those meetings at the White House. Minister LeBlanc, nice to see you again.
Good morning, Rosemary.
So the Prime Minister came out of this meeting saying that this marked the end of the beginning of a process in terms of redefining the relationship. What do you think the future of the relationship looks like, having been there beside him for that meeting with the President?
I hope it's a more constructive, business-like approach to growing the economies of both countries. The Prime Minister took considerable time to explain to the President, who listened attentively, why the continued application, for example, of these tariffs is not in the economic interest of both the United States or Canada. We talked about how if we work collaboratively on economic opportunities and security partnerships for both countries, there's an economic benefit that would apply to Canada and the United States. So I was encouraged, Rosemary, that Secretary Lutnick reached out the evening we got back from Washington. So last Tuesday, when I landed, he wanted to have a quick chat. There's obviously a desire to move as quickly as we can, but recognizing that there's still a lot of work ahead of us, and we're not at the position we want to be in yet, which is to have these tariffs removed.
One of the things that I understood was, well, we've reported that was brought up at the table was around the so-called fentanyl tariffs, and really an attempt by the Canadian side to explain to the President that this has been dealt with. This is a thing that should go away. Did you get the impression that that resonated with him, that those tariffs could be lifted sooner than some of the others, for instance?
So obviously hopeful that that's the case. As you know, some of the tariffs that he applied to different sectors of the economy applied internationally, or globally, I should say, to all countries. The idea that Canada is a source of fentanyl in the United States, or that the illegal migration at the border is something that is not very much controlled, is not accurate. And the Prime Minister, I think, took considerable time to talk about the investments we made, the commitments we made in the election to add 20% more RCMP and Canadian Border Services officers. The President listened attentively, and in our conversations, my colleague David McGuinty is ongoing and active discussions with the Border Czar, Tom Homan. The President, I think, and Secretary Lutnick has acknowledged that both in terms of fentanyl and illegal migration, there has been enormous progress made by Canada and the United States together.
Is this something that is going to be now negotiated, the next steps, within the framework of the trade deal that different people think it's alive or dead, but within the confines of that framework? Or is this something that needs a fresh start, sort of as we saw from the United Kingdom this week, saying they now have a deal to start negotiating a deal? What is your sense of how that's going to work for us?
So again, we've asked ourselves those questions. I've talked to a number of my colleagues in Ottawa about that exact question. It's obvious that we're not going to wait till the obligatory review of the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement in 2026 to make progress on the tariffs that have hit us for the last number of months. We have no reason to think, by the way, the Americans are interested in triggering an earlier review of the Free Trade Agreement. They haven't indicated that to us, but they are interested in discussing how Canada and the United States can work on economic and security issues together. And hopefully that partnership will lead to the removal of the tariffs. So the question is a good one. I'm not sure we have a clear answer yet.
But the president did seem he seemed to talk well about the agreement, which I think was kind of surprising or perhaps encouraging for Canadians. So does that mean that you would be open to an early review, that you feel that he wants to keep that agreement in place in some way?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak for the president. I did.
No, just what your perception of things.
Well, and I had the same impression that you did, Rosemary. He spoke favorably or more constructively about the agreement than perhaps in previous public comments. But the American government isn't respecting the agreement, certainly as we had understood it when it was signed by President Trump in his first term. They have, and I think this is important, in some of the fentanyl. The application of fentanyl tariffs, said that exports that are compliant with things like the rules of origin, that's the vast majority of Canadian exports, are able to be compliant with the conditions of the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. So that we took as encouraging. That has been the basis of my conversations with Secretary Lutnick. But our overwhelming priority, Rosemary, is to, as quickly as we can, get to a circumstance where the tariffs that have applied to Canada are lifted. And obviously then our retaliatory tariffs would also be lifted, but they remain in place while this circumstance persists.
So what are the next steps then, concretely? What is yours? I mean, obviously the two leaders will speak at the G7, but the work that has to be done by you and others between now and then, what will we watch for, Minister?
So the president is traveling internationally, he told us, next week. I think Secretary Lutnick and others will be traveling with him. The trade representative, Ambassador Greer, I don't think is in Washington next week. My hope is that very quickly upon their return, we can sit down and map out a short-term work plan that'll lead to the lifting of some, ultimately all of these tariffs. But let's start as quickly as we can with the obvious ones that, in our view, no longer have applicability. So our hope is to very quickly get to work over the next 10 days. You're right, the president is coming to Kananaskis, Alberta for the G7 summit in the middle of June. We hope to make some progress before then, but we're just going to keep our shoulder to the wheel, Rosemary, until we get the outcomes that Canadians expect.
The 51st state comment, I'll just bring this up because the new U.S. ambassador to Canada said to, I believe it was the National Post, that those comments are now behind us. Did you leave that meeting thinking that after what the Prime Minister said directly in the Oval and then the things he said subsequently to the President, that those statements are not going to be heard anymore?
I hope so, Rosemary. I think the Prime Minister was very firm in his public comments with the President there in the Oval Office, and that tone on that particular issue continued in the private working lunch that after the public portion of the meeting. But I hope that's the case. It's certainly not constructive to getting us to a trade agreement that I think Canadians expect our government to work diligently towards. But again, Rosemary, the idea that we're going to be able to control or rely on the president not to veer into this kind of comment, or his spokespersons that are at the podium in the White House. To be honest, I think the Prime Minister has been clear publicly and privately. Our job is to focus on substantive elements of progress. I hope and believe it'll be different, but maybe our hopes have been dashed in this regard before.
We are getting, there is a new cabinet that will be sworn in this coming week on Tuesday. Would I expect to see you in your portfolio, given the way you are currently speaking about some of the work to do and your relationship with Secretary Lutnick?
Rosemary, you've been around this a long time. I'm certainly not going to offer any views on the Prime Minister's decision with respect to the cabinet next week. I hope I can continue to make a contribution, and I'm enthusiastic about the work ahead.
I would imagine, though, you would see a benefit to having some stability in the role of a trade minister.
Again, full points for trying a second time. Right. It's not going to work, but thank you for asking. Thanks,
Minister. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
It would really be a wonderful marriage because it's two places that get along very well. They like each other a lot.
Well, if I may, as you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
Canada is stepping up the military participation because Mark knew, they were low, and now they're stepping it up, and that's a very important thing. But never say never. Never say never.
Prime Minister Carney tried to reset relations between Canada and the United States last week. Are there any real shifts? How will this Oval Office meeting shape future negotiations? Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. Charelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times in Ottawa. Tyler Dawson's an Alberta correspondent for the National Post in Edmonton. Paul Wells is a journalist and author joining us from Montreal today. Good to see everyone. Paul, I think I'm going to start with you. What did you make of how the Prime Minister managed the president a little bit, both publicly and from what we know happened privately after?
One gets the impression it went quite well. Mark Carney didn't say much, didn't seek to correct the president on any of his many fanciful statements, served up some flattery, which the White House promptly used in a promotional video to show that Canada is on the long list of countries whose leaders adore Donald Trump. And then he said the stuff about, as you know, from real estate, some places aren't for sale, and the owners of Canada tell us that Canada's not for sale. And he stuck to that line. Look, I think it went as well as a meeting with Donald Trump can go. It might soon be time for Canada's leaders to start to ask serious questions about how useful any meeting with Donald Trump can be. There's every chance that he'll forget by tomorrow whatever he said last week. And you know, it's great that he seems to view Mark Carney differently from Justin Trudeau. Yeah. But the so-called provocations that set him against Trudeau were minor at best. And so any day now, Mark Carney might make an offhand remark about the weather, and suddenly Donald Trump is his worst enemy. One never knows.
Yeah, Charelle, I mean, I think that, as Paul points to, is the big challenge here. There will be a plan going forward for negotiating some sort of outcome for all of this, but it really does depend on how the president is feeling from one day to the next, it would seem.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I went back just out of curiosity because everybody talks about how much Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau didn't like each other, which was true. There were clear ideological and every other kind of difference between the two of them. But that first Oval Office meeting in 2017, it actually went roughly about the same. And it had kind of the same type of response when people said, you know what, that went well. There had been, you know, some dust-ups before with other leaders in the Oval Office. There's that weirdness about how to handle the handshake and all that stuff. And everybody kind of, the reviews that came out of that first 2017 meeting were, okay, not too bad. Obviously, things quickly deteriorated from there, but at the time, that was the sense. Everybody talks about Donald Trump liking people who are strong. He admires strength. But I think you could say that throughout the course of like the NAFTA renegotiations, Canada came at it from a pretty strong standpoint, and he really didn't like that. To the point that even last week in the Oval Office, he was still talking about it and you know, alluding to how much he didn't like Chrystia Freeland, who was one of the key negotiators of that deal. So however much he might like Mark Carney right now, once they actually get down to brass tacks, that, you know, that relationship could deteriorate just in the same way, you know, or it could take much less than that, as Paul just alluded to.
Tyler, do you think, though, the fact that the president seems to respect the prime minister right now, does that help the conversation for this country as they engage on the substantive piece now?
Well, it's comforting. I mean, we'd be having a very, very different conversation if it was obvious from last week's meeting that Trump thought Carney was a left-wing lunatic or something like that, and didn't show him, you know, the remotest respect in that meeting. So in that sense, it went as well, I think, as the others have said, as well as possible. And it does seem that he has some respect for Carney. And I think it's tricky maybe to say where that comes from. I mean, I know some commentators have said, oh, it's because Carney's, you know, a strong chap and Trump respects that. I think it's, you know, perhaps just as likely that Carney is wealthy and reasonably famous, and that's the sort of thing that Donald Trump gravitates towards. So I don't think we really know why he seems to like Mark Carney. And of course, as the others have said too, the big question is whether or not he will continue to like Mark Carney. And once we get down to negotiations, how he will feel about any of the people involved in that discussion. I mean, if you put her, for example, Chrystia Freeland back in that pool, that could be perhaps a tactical misstep by the Canadian government. So who knows? As the others have said, Who knows?
We'll talk about cabinet in the next hour. I don't think they'll put Chrystia Freeland back in that role. That's my sense. But Paul, what does the Prime Minister have to do now, though, given that he got elected largely on this issue and how he would deal with Donald Trump? So as they get ready to do some sort of negotiation in the coming weeks, what is the bar here for the Prime Minister in terms of delivering for Canadians?
I would urge the Prime Minister to go back and listen back to the speech he made very early on during the campaign that had the more impact than anything he said for the rest of the campaign, which is that he was turning the page on a 60-year relationship of ever-deepening economic and social security integration that is over. If it's over, then turn the page. Turn it to the East and the West, to Asia and Europe. Name an ambassador to Germany. We haven't had one for 6 months. Show up at international conferences with something to say and contribute. Listen to emissaries from other countries when they visit Canada, and so on and so on. As Carney knows from Brexit, building new relationships with distant countries is far harder than maintaining relationships with your neighbors would have been if that was an option. And this is not sexy, it will not get headlines, but it cannot work if Canada does not make serious changes to its relationships with Asia and Europe.
Well, and he seems to understand some of that, I think, Charelle, given what his first trip was before the election and some of the things that he's been saying and some of the people, to Paul's point, that he's been speaking with, too.
Yeah, absolutely. He's definitely, I think, already making some of those inroads. But the fact is that you have to negotiate with the United States. Like, that's not something that we can actually just kind of let fall by the wayside. But I think tempering people's expectations as to what is actually possible when it comes to negotiations with the United States is going to be very, very important to kind of set the stage or set the tone for people to think, oh, okay, the relationships, on the mend, we're going to sit down and talk and everybody's going to be an adult in the room and things will work out. I think that would be sending the wrong message. Yeah. There was a former diplomat, Roy Norton, who told us at the Hill Times this past week that anybody who thinks that Canada and the U.S. getting to a new, set deal is, I believe the words he used were, deluding themselves profoundly. And so we have to be thinking about the fact that we are not going to get to what we used to have. Yeah. Looking at the other, deals, if you want to call them that the U.S. president has made with other countries. The things that are sticking points like tariffs, those aren't going anywhere. So we have to deal with the new reality and know that whatever's going to happen going forward with the U.S. is going to be very incremental and probably not that, groundbreaking. Last
30 seconds to you there, Tyler.
I think the other thing to consider when we're talking about shifting east-west trade exports to Asia, Europe, sitting out here in Edmonton, gotta bring up the oil and gas thing. What does that look like in the future? That is a tough political sell in parts of Canada. If there's going to need to be new infrastructure, if there's going to be some way of upping production and exports, things like that. And that's, I think, going to be a very, very challenging conversation for the federal Liberals to have at this moment. But I guess we'll see how that goes.
Okay, Charelle, Tyler, Paul, I'll let you guys get a coffee. We'll talk next hour about the cabinet and speculate wildly. No, we won't. We'll be very smart and make educated guesses. Thank you. Talk in a moment. Top U.S. officials are meeting their Chinese counterparts this weekend in Geneva. This follows an agreement to make a trade deal between the U.S. and the U.K. and, of course, Prime Minister Carney's first in-person meeting with President Trump. A busy week, lots to get through for our American Roundtable. Katie Simpson is the CBC's senior Washington correspondent. She's in Washington. And Matina Stevis-Gridneff is the Canada bureau chief for the New York Times, and she's in Toronto. Good to see both of you. Appreciate you making the time. Let's start with what happened with Canada's Prime Minister, that meeting. Obviously, the tone was different. The president seemed to respect the prime minister. What did you make in terms of, Katie, whether this was an actual shift for the two countries?
Well, we certainly noticed it, and you could tell the Canadian officials going into the room, they were quite nervous, they were quite tense. And when you talk to people about what it was like inside that room, they'll agree with you. But I think what we're really going to see is how successful, or if this was successful, based on how quickly Canada can start some kind of trade talks with the Americans. How much of a priority is Ottawa for Washington? Once we learn that, because remember, the White House is trying to negotiate 90 deals with 90 countries in 90 days, part of Donald Trump's very aggressive trade agenda. So far, the only thing we've seen is a tentative agreement, or an agreement to agree with the UK. But how quickly can Canada sort of get in there, start those negotiations to hopefully find an off-ramp to the tariffs before they start talking about CUSMA review?
Matina, you traveled with the Prime Minister, if I'm not mistaken. What did you make of how he handled himself in the Oval and then beyond?
I think it was a very low bar for success for Prime Minister Carney. It was a vibes meeting, and in that, I think he was quite successful. I mean, there were no expectations for a breakthrough in the substance of the relationship, but the tone and where that tone was set, that tone of respect that Katie referenced, I think that was very significant. I don't want to dismiss it, but I do think that his sole goal really was to not have that meeting explode and not have a sort of like Zelensky moment with the president. And in that, absolutely, he was successful. He really regulated himself when he stopped and interrupted the president, what he said, what he didn't respond to and react to. So in that very constricted universe of that meeting, I think it was successful, but it was a very, very small beginning.
Katie, we've been, and I'll ask you this, Matina, too. The president did talk about CUSMA, or USMCA, and I think that was surprising to some people because others, including the Prime Minister, have said this is dead. But it now appears as though this maybe is the framework in which the two countries are going to negotiate something. Give me your sense of where we stand on that.
Well, it's my understanding from talking to sources that that review of CUSMA is going to happen next year. I know there's been a lot of advocacy to just get it underway ASAP, so perhaps there can be some sort of negotiation to get the extra tariffs that Canada is facing right now dealt with over, if that can be a path to an off-ramp. But Donald Trump's language in the Oval Office itself, he often will contradict himself. That is not something that's unusual in the way he'll talk about it. You know, 1 minute it's the USMCA, as he calls it, is the greatest trade deal ever negotiated. He said it was an off-ramp from NAFTA and then, questioned whether it needs to be reviewed or renewed at all, but then pulled back to the point that, yes, it is something that they're going to review. So the expectation is that next year, those conversations will begin as planned. However, there still remains an advocacy push from some within Canadian business, some Canadian within the sort of political class to just start it now, rip off that Band-Aid and push ahead now, rather than wait in the hopes that it can get some relief from some of the tariffs that exist.
Matina, is it an advantage, do you think, for Canada that free trade agreement is there, whether it's being respected or not is a different thing, but that's there as a basis for a negotiation?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we've already seen some of the benefits of whatever remains of the USMCA or CUSMA, which is that, it has been used as the basis for exempting many Canadian goods from tariffs. We've seen that. The sort of CUSMA compliant goods are being exempted at the moment. All that being said, I am in two minds about whether the Prime Minister wants to rush into a renegotiation. And indeed, I don't know that we're sure that this is going to be whatever happens next. It is going to be a tripartite free trade agreement that includes Mexico. I think those questions are very much up in the air. I think obviously market participants, business people, everyone's looking after their own product, their own industry. They have an interest to push for relief quickly. But I think Mark Carney has an interest in waiting. He has expressed a desire to be patient, and he has warned us that patience might be costly and painful, but it might be worth it in the end.
Let's talk about the country that did manage to get some sort of something this week, Katie, and that's the United Kingdom. How significant is this?
Well, the thing is, it's not isn't done yet, right? They made this announcement. Whether, it's unclear why they made this announcement and did it so quickly. Is it because the Trump administration is under pressure to reach a win? They haven't announced any sort of trade agreements yet. Did they think the symbolism of announcing it on VE Day was something to be proud of and they could sort of, launch it from there? But the deal isn't done just yet. No one's signed on the dotted line. It does provide a roadmap for what some countries can expect. Donald Trump at the time said the 10% baseline tariff that applies to most countries right now, it's going to remain in place. But then we heard him sort of say, well, maybe that won't be the case at a later time. So again, we sort of have a roadmap for it. The UK is apparently going to get relief from the steel and aluminum tariffs. Yeah. That's something Canada would very much like to get as well. And it appears that the UK will open up some more market access for American products. However, it's unclear just how much more access some American producers will get, particularly when it comes to some of the agricultural products, beef in particular. The UK has some standards that some American products don't meet, and the UK is saying it's not going to change its standards. So while, on paper it might say new market access, we still don't have the final details to see exactly how this is going to change things for trade between the UK and the US.
Matina, it does show, though, that a deal is possible, even if it's not done, it's not signed. It shows that there is something that the president wants from all this.
A deal is the point, right? And and you're right. Is it a good deal? It doesn't look like it's a great deal. Maybe President Trump needed a deal, and maybe Prime Minister Starmer needed a deal.
Yeah,
he was also under pressure. Yeah. And so it's not clear to me that Canada should be rushing to that kind of fast agreement that is piecemeal. Again, I think Prime Minister Carney has spoken about a comprehensive rearrangement, renegotiation of the whole of the relationship, and not being at the whims of President Trump. And since we're talking about beef, I really want to direct you to the New York Times website, where there's a great story about what the beef is with American beef. And I think readers will find that interesting, the different standards. And that's something that's an issue here in Canada, too.
I haven't read that. So good plug there, Matina. Thank you for that. Just 30 seconds to both of you on the China talks. Katie?
So far we're getting very little detail about what's going on inside the room, other than Donald Trump saying, it's a respectful reset. Really, this is what the world is watching because it has such broad and important implications. Right now, we're seeing less port traffic, particularly on the U.S. West Coast, means fewer goods are coming in, less work for port workers, less work for truck drivers, and we could start to see some shortages on U.S. shelves very soon.
Last word to you, Matina, on that.
And for the European Union and for Canada, this sort of psychodrama with China and the moving goalposts of that relationship with the United States, I think, makes the job of Prime Minister Carney and European leaders much harder. Where do these powers stand vis-a-vis China? Are they trying to mimic or separate themselves from the United States? This continues to be in flux, and these are vital relationships that will continue to be uncertain.
Really smart conversation. Katie Simpson, thank you for always being with us on a Sunday. And Matina Stevis-Gridneff, glad you accepted our invitation. Hope you'll come back.
Thank you.